We are today appropriately inside the Tustin Area Museum in Old Town Tustin to interview Margaret Pottenger, who's a longtime Tustin resident, a rather famous entrepreneur, and the first woman to be elected Woman of the Year in the Tustin Area Woman of the Year contest in 1966, as I recall.
That's right.
Margaret, we're just delighted to have the opportunity to ask you a few questions about the past. We're interested in Old Town Tustin in the early days and your recollections of what things were like, what life was like in the culture of the old days. So tell us a little bit about how you wound up here.
Well, I was a buyer for a department store in Santa Ana, and I decided it was time to leave that store because I had a boss that I didn't get along with. So it was time for either him to go or for me to go. Guess who?
And you had an entrepreneurial spirit, right?
I had an entrepreneurial spirit. And I had a family that was willing to put up the money, which is important, you know, when you're starting a business. I thought that Laguna Beach was the place because it was the star of Orange County at the time. And I had a place all picked out down there, and when we got down there, it had already been rented. And it was probably just as well that I didn't end up in Laguna, because those little stores on that street down there change hands every year, and there's always something new in the building that you thought you wanted. So we were coming back through a place called Tustin. And this is when the freeway had just bypassed Old Town Tustin. This used to be the main highway to San Diego, and the freeway had just cut off Tustin. And here was this lonely looking little town, really lonely looking. And we were looking in a window of a place on El Camino Real that had been originally the Prescott's Ranch Market. And they had just glassed it in and hoped to lease it out to somebody to put a store. And we looked in the window and we thought, you know, this might not be too bad. And as we were looking in that window, we looked across the street, and here was this darling little building called the Jabberwocky. And it had a for rent sign in the window, and 15 minutes later, we had rented that building.
15 minutes?
15 minutes to rent that building.
And what was the weather like that day? Was it raining?
Oh, it was in February. It was raining.
Raining.
Yeah, it was. But anyway, we rented that building, and I went back and I quit my job, and you won't believe what I did. I took driving lessons because I owned a car. I had an old MG, one of the original MGs, sitting in the garage that I had bought, but I didn't know how to drive. So I took driving lessons, and because I knew that if I lived in Santa Ana and had to go to Tustin, I'd have to drive, which I did.
I remember that car.
Do you?
Yes, my dad was John Sowers, and we lived over on Pacific. And I remember probably more than one time you'd come around the corner and he'd be out there working, so you guys would stop and chat. And I remember the MG.
Wonderful car.
Yeah.
I had it for years.
Yeah, I
know,
said,
my niece Nancy Prescott has a whole collection of pictures that were painted by, do you remember the name of the man who did the Old Town Tustin pictures? He had a picture of all the old buildings, like the blacksmith shop and my place and a few others. And she has this whole collection of paintings, which is just fantastic. But my store shows a picture of my car sitting in front.
So you took your buying experience that you already had, and how did you pick? Was it teenage fashion? Was that the theme?
I was when I was the buyer for Rankin's Dry Goods, I had infants, children's, girls, teens, toys, and Girl Scouts. These were the departments that I bought for. And I've debated whether to go into a baby store or a teenage store, and I made the right selection, teenagers.
And you had a lot of fashion shows, is that right?
Oh, I had fashion shows all the time. One of our big fashion shows was in the Jamestown Village Theater. Jamestown used to have a little theater in the round, and I think we were one of the first people that had a show there. And we had the Beach Boys. The genuine Beach Boys came in their Pendleton jackets, and they couldn't sing because of their, their contracts they have. But the man who brought them had a little music store called the, what'd they call that music store? Remember it? The Mad Platter. Okay, the Mad Platter. Jack Nelson and the Mad Platter. And Jack would spin the tunes and they would pretend to sing.
Just to keep within the confines of their contract.
Yes.
That's amazing. The
And they did
teenage
2
girls probably
shows
loved it.
2 shows in one day. We didn't always have the Beach Boys, but that year
Yeah.
we did.
Well, that's great. That's great.
So Jamestown probably doesn't even, there's probably nobody left down there that would know that, except me.
I'm on it's called Facebook. It's a social media site, and I kind of put out there because I know a lot of the girls that grew up in Tustin that know you and bought dresses from you.
Really?
So I got a message from a girl named Sharon Reyes. We called
Yes.
her Ronnie Reyes. She says, I first met Margaret when I was with Rankins in Santa Ana, when she was with Rankins in Santa Ana. I was about 12, and I remember going to the second floor where she had the prettiest dresses I had ever seen. She asked me to do some modeling for her, but it was when she moved to Tustin and opened the Jabberwocky that our friendship began. Miss Pottenger became a role model for many young girls, always a lady with much poise and grace and a great sense of humor.
Sharon Reyes.
Sharon Reyes.
You know who Sharon was? Her mother was the teller over at the bank, the beautiful one.
Mhm.
And she married Jack Hall, who was the manager of the Up Juice Company. And Sharon, when Sharon first realized that her mother was going to leave her and get married, she wasn't very happy about it. But eventually, Jack became her best friend. And when she was introduced as Miss Tustin, Jack escorted her across the stage. So that was Sharon, and she was one of my early customers. She used to be able to walk. Back when I opened that store, mothers did not work. There was a lady over in the place called the McCharles House today, but back then it was Miss Jeannie's nursery school, and Jeannie Strader babysat all the children of the mothers who worked, which was about a half a dozen. And Sharon was one of them who went to Miss Jeannie's school. The grade school was right across the street, and they would just cross the street to go to Miss Jeannie's, which was McCharles House.
That's great. Now, what other enterprises were close to the Jabberwocky that you recall?
Let me see, what was down, well, they hadn't built Jamestown Village yet, but Mr. Gilbreth, who owned that property, was getting ready to develop the property. And when he did, he had a restaurant on the corner, and he had a toy shop. The Fife and Drum Toy Shop was on the right-hand side, and that's where Ivy's is now, but that was the toy store. And Lou Girding was in there. He was the photographer that did everything in those days. And they had, what else did they have?
Was there something called Tustin Food Center?
Tustin Food Center was on the other side of the street, and yes, that was the only food center in town. And that was what is now Cox's Market.
It was more of a grocery store than
It was a
eatery.
grocery
It
store,
wasn't like a
right.
restaurant.
And there was a young man over there who used to bring my groceries across the street after I had bought them. And he would bring his little stamper that had the ink in it that they stamp prices with. This is what they used to do. And he'd stamp it all over the thing because my cat just loved the smell of that. And the cat would roll over. I had a cat.
So you were an early member of the Chamber of Commerce, is that right?
I was the first female
The first
member
female member.
of the chamber. And the chamber was the major organization. Well, I shouldn't say, there were two. The other was a women's club and the Chamber of Commerce, and they were both started by Bill Moses, who owned the Tustin News. And he was a very enterprising man, and he started the chamber and he got it going. And the chamber did everything. They backed all the bonds, they built the city hall, they put the sewers in, and we didn't have sewers in those days. And I remember, I think it was Lou Girding saying, "We don't need sewers in this town." Can you imagine a town without sewers? But we finally got our sewers, and the street was all dug up for a long time. And Red Hill was dug up all the way down to the freeway when
Probably
they put
not
in the
too good for
sewers.
business, but it had to be done.
But we got our sewers in Tustin. Along this street, there were no trees, there wasn't anything. If you work on those little third grade tours, you know they used to feed the horses out here water. But I belonged to a group that decided they were going to plant trees in Old Town Tustin. And I remember we got together, Roy Unger, who owned the hardware store, and Bill, or G.O. Bixler, who ran the bank, and Bill Moses and John Prescott and I got together down in the bank building, and we decided we were going to plant trees. And we had tree, flagpole, and all up and down the street we had flagpoles. We were very patriotic people here.
Good idea.
And I remember one of my salesmen coming through town one day, and I said, "Is today a holiday of some sort?" We put those flags out every day. I had a flag, both a flag and a tree in front of my place. And look at the size of the trees today. They were, like 3 feet tall
3 feet
when we
tall.
put them in.
They're huge now.
And this Downtown Merchants Association that put those in lasted just long enough to plant those trees, and that was the end of the association.
Now, to put this in perspective, what year did you open the Jabberwocky?
In 1959,
59.
yes. April 18th, 1959.
Quite a date, 59.
Yes.
Well, that was a good era for patriotism, and it was
Well,
the
the
beginning
patriotism came a couple of years
it was
later.
it was quite a bit of peaceful years in there between
Yes.
Korea and Vietnam. So that's a good time to be selling teenage clothing and selling anything.
Patriotic years.
Now, as I recall, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you did something for civil defense.
Civil defense.
Yes. They made you
Hey.
they made you a civil defense
Oh,
person
yeah. When was that?
during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh,
That
that's
would have been
right, it
62.
was. And we met in the basement of the Presbyterian Church. I remember that now. It didn't last very long.
There was a fear there of a nuclear attack.
How did you know that?
from listening to your
I have forgotten all about
from
that.
listening to your tape from
Okay.
1988.
So that's right, we did have that civil defense thing. And I think that Leola Cox, who was Phil Cox's mother, who ran the market over here, and I were, we didn't have our caps yet, but we were the people for this block.
That's interesting. Well, tell us a little bit about becoming the first woman to be Woman of the Year. Was that?
Woman of the Year, okay. Well,
'Cause
back.
they'd had Man of the Year for years, but
Yeah.
no Woman of the Year.
But one of the big things of the chamber was their annual installation of officers. And this was a really big party that they had up at the Red Hill Tennis Club, which is at the top of Browning Street. They call it something else now, but it was the Red Hill Tennis Club then. And every year they had a big banquet, and the final thing they did was name the Man of the Year. Well, the year that I became Woman of the Year, they wanted to name me Man of the Year, but they couldn't bring themselves to do it. Can you believe
I
that?
can't believe it.
They couldn't tell me. So they created a new category. This was the first time in 1966. I almost became Man of the Year,
Well, that's
but I didn't.
that's really great
So
that they
anyway,
started the new.
I have pictures of the installation, and they would first have the installation of officers, very important, and then they would have the Man of the Year. And when I was the Man of the Year,
Woman of
when
the
I
Year.
became Woman of the Year, what was his name over there who was the Man of the Year?
I don't remember.
Over at the Waterworks. Quick,
I don't have the names. in front of
I
me.
have it written down. Anyway, I can remember what I wore. I can't remember what he wore, but I remember what I wore to be Woman of the Year. And it was a total surprise. I had no idea that they were doing that. So that was in 1966.
Good to be surprised. That's fun. Now, how many years was the Jabberwocky in business?
We were there for about 30 years.
30
And
years.
during the period of time that we were in Old Town Tustin, I opened a second store in Enderley Center. In fact, I was one of the first tenants in Enderley Center. And when I left there, Enderley Center was the place to shop in Orange County for years. And
What was the name of your store there?
it was called the Jabberwocky.
The Jabberwocky.
And it was a pretty good sized store. We had an upstairs, right up the center of the when you walked into the room, the center thing, you just go straight upstairs. And the sportswear was upstairs, the dresses and the formals and things were downstairs. Anyway, to me, it was a pretty good sized store. And I was up there for 5 years.
5 years.
When I decided that was either that store or this store, and this was me. So I had to close that one. It was when my lease had run out.
Mm-hmm. Well, 30 years is quite a few years to have the one here in Old
Yeah.
Town Tustin.
30 years in Old Town Tustin.
Now, at that time when your store was open here, what were the restaurants like around here? Where did people hang out?
Let's see, we had a restaurant over here on, have you ever seen this?
Yes, the map over there?
Yes? Okay. There was a restaurant over here on Main Street, and I forget what it was called. And the Revere House was the big place. Everybody went to the Revere House. And there was a man in the main dining room there who would mix your Caesar salad right at your table. This was the big thing, was to go in for lunch and have Caesar salad at the Revere House. And the Revere House at that time was a very fancy restaurant, and they had a little cove in there where they just served breakfast. But now, if you drive by there, it's sitting there with boards all over the window. And unfortunately, they can never revive that building because it is so full of smoke. People used to smoke, people used to smoke, and they smoked in that restaurant, and the place smelled like smoke.
There was also the construction of 55 freeway through there.
Yes.
It was probably very disruptive.
Well, when the Revere House was there, you used to come down Tustin Avenue to First Street and then turn this way, and then the rest of the way to the beach area. This was before the freeway went in through there. So, but the Revere House was a turning spot there. Anyway, it was very, very popular place at the time. That was the big one. And then the other one that opened was Saddleback Inn. It was actually in Santa Ana, but it was a very popular.
Right on the edge of Tustin.
Yeah, right. So those were the two big restaurants. And of course, on this street, we had, what was that name? What's the name of the?
Ruby's.
Ruby's Cafe was on this street. And that was all that was here.
Well, I'm
So-
sure that the 5 freeway was a big disruption to what took place.
Oh, it was.
This was originally called D Street, was it not?
This was D.
D.
DCBA. I mean, really creative names. Main Street, First, Second, Third, Fourth.
A, B, C, D, and 1,
Yes.
2, 3, 4.
Now,
Now,
creative names.
there were a lot of filling stations here in the old days. They all had to close, right?
Yes,
And motels. So there was
Okay.
quite a change in this street
yes.
because
Anyway,
all because of the freeway.
But this was the main
The main drag.
main highway to San Diego. And if you look at this old map that we have on the wall here, I love it. It shows the road going down Main Street in Santa Ana to First and out First and down our street and past Tustin High School going towards San Diego. In the olden days, there was no highway between Newport and Laguna. You had to come inland to go to Laguna. And you take a look at that map and you'll see it's no highway.
That's
Isn't
really
that
out of the way to
amazing?
go from Newport to Laguna by coming up this far. Wow. That's
So
amazing.
anyway,
What organizations were you in other than the Chamber and the Women's Club?
Women's Club, well, I was president of the Seroptimus Club of Santa Ana and Tustin. At the time that I was president, there wasn't anybody in Tustin that belonged to it. Everything was Santa Ana. But eventually, Tustin became the important thing, and Santa Ana sort of disappeared. So
And where
anyway,
did you meet for
we,
Seroptimus?
let's see, we had a house on on Broadway in Santa Ana, and we had a unique way of building our house. They bought the house in about 1955, and I don't know where, I think some wealthy members gave the money for the down payment, which is probably $1,000. You know how it was in those days. Then we used to bring each person was responsible for providing the food once a year for their lunches. And we used to pay for our lunches. And the money we paid for our lunches went to pay off our loan. And that's how we bought the house. And that's a unique way of buying a house these days. But that was back in the 50s.
Prices were very cheap then.
Yes, they were certainly cheaper than they are now.
Now, when the Jabberwocky closed, was that your move into retirement? You didn't have any other?
Retirement. What is that?
Well, you were active, but
Well,
you weren't running any
after
business
I
after that, were you?
left the store, I went to work for the Broadway
Oh.
department store in Anaheim as a bridal consultant. Now, a bridal consultant feeds the computer with all the things the bride wants for her gifts. It has nothing to do with clothes, it's the gifts. And I used to go around with the brides and help them select their china and their crystal and all these things that people have. And then I would feed it into the computer. Right now, I don't know how to work a computer, but back then I did. And I worked in Anaheim for 3 years, and then they moved me to Orange. They had a store in Orange. They closed the store in Anaheim. That Broadway in Anaheim was the first major department store in Orange County. There were small department stores like the one that I worked for in Santa Ana, but the Broadway was the first big one that started a branch, and it was a very big store. And not only was it big, but it had a tea room where you could go and have lunches. And it was very, very different in those days. But after it closed, the whole shopping center where it was closed, they moved to their store in Orange, and I worked there for 3 years. Why did I leave there? Oh, I got hired by UCI Hospital over at, in Anaheim. I ran the gift shop in the hospital for 3 years. And that was my next job. And after that, then I went to work for Tustin Thrift and Loan, doing small claims in courts. Well, I didn't know anything about courts until I got this job, but I learned very quickly. And I went to courthouses all over Southern California. And a lot of them were like Hemet and Cucamonga, San Pedro, all over. And during that period of time, I also had 2 volunteer jobs. One was I worked at the Orange County Performing Arts Center, and I worked there for the first 15 years the center was there.
Wow.
And then I worked for the Angel Stadium.
Wow. And what'd you do there?
I was an usher.
You got to see a lot of ball games.
I had the best section in the whole center. It was on what they called the view level, which is, you've probably never been there, but it's at the very top.
Yeah.
And the lower view goes right over the field, and the upper view goes to hell and God. But anyway, lower view. If I ever bought seasons tickets, I would buy tickets in the lower view over first base, which is where I was. And all the action is at first base.
Yes.
Well, the last year that I worked there was
That
the
would've
year
been
they
during
went to the World Series.
Oh, wow. That Gene Autry had sold it by then, hadn't he?
Oh, yeah.
Disney.
Gene Autry wasn't there anymore.
Disney owned it.
Michael Eisner was running. We were members of the Disney, whatever they call it. And what do they call it? They have a name for it. Anyway, the year that I left there, they were going to have a strike. The players all over the United States were going to have a strike. And the fans were not very happy about all these well-paid
Oh, no.
players
Going on
having a
strike.
strike. And so the night before the strike was supposed to start, in the stadium, whenever somebody would hit a foul ball, and you used to keep your foul ball, people would throw the foul balls back, and they were throwing foul balls all over the field, and they were throwing trash on the field, and they were not happy. But that was just before we went into the World Series.
2002.
And I can't understand how we got into the World Series, but we must have been pretty good
Yeah,
that
we
year.
were. 2002.
We must have been good.
Yeah, we were.
Well, during the playoffs, about 3 days before the last playoff, I was in a near fatal automobile accident.
Oh, really?
Yes. I learned a lesson. I was coming down Prospect from the hairdressers to 17th Street, and I had a green light and I went through. A car coming out 17th Street had a red light and they went through.
Mm.
And I learned my lesson that if I ever did this again, you don't assume that you have the right of way. You wait.
And you look. in
So
both-
my car ended upside down in the gutter,
Oh, no.
and I was in intensive care during the World Series.
Oh, no.
And my sister came out from Virginia to babysit me, and she said, you didn't see the World Series. You were asleep the whole time.
What a shame.
So that
Well,
was my
you were
World
lucky
Series.
if it was that serious to pull through.
That was a very good series. And after that, I went back to Virginia for 2 years so they could woo me back to health. And when I came back to sunny Southern California, I started doing volunteer work again. I couldn't do the stadium, and I couldn't do the South Coast because you had to go up and down stairs, which I can't do anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do stairs, but I work at the blood bank. I still work. I had been working at the blood bank ever since 1961.
61.
And recently they honored me as being, I think, the longest living volunteer in Orange County for working at the blood bank. And
That's fantastic.
I work at the library, and they burnt down the library, which was a dumb thing to do, but they did. So I'm not working at the library, at least not this week. But then there's this wonderful little museum in Old Town Tustin, and we do little third grade tours. And when I'm not doing third grade tours in here with my friend Joe Spreckelmeyer, I belong to a group of 3 that we go out to some of the schools. And I am the farmer's wife, and what's his name? Ben Larson is the farmer. And Joe does a wonderful thing on the Civil War. And if you ever want Joe to do a thing for you, have him describe how he explains slavery to these children who have no idea what slavery is. And he is so, he's a retired school teacher, but he is so good at that. I listen
Now,
to
what
it every time.
age group are you talking to at these schools? Is this middle school?
Third grade
Third grade,
students. Yeah, we go out to the schools and do third grade classes.
They're the same age that come in here to do the
Yes,
tours.
definitely. Sometimes they come in here and sometimes we go out to the schools. So anyway, Joe is so good. He really is. And I wish I could explain it as well as he does, but I just sit there and listen to him when he does it.
He doesn't do that here on the tours.
No,
so
he doesn't.
Only when
I,
you go out.
I don't think it's ever come up here. But he wears this Civil War enactment uniform.
Oh.
He belonged to a group down at Huntington Beach. That
The
he doesn't-
reenactors.
Yeah. He doesn't do it anymore, but he has a uniform, and that's what he wears. And so he has to explain his uniform and his knives and his guns and all the things that he has. So anyway, you get Joe
Yeah,
sometime.
I'll do that. Well, Margaret, I'm just amazed at the career you had after the Jabberwocky closed. I had no idea all the things you had done after that. You're so well known for the Jabberwocky.
Oh, I know, but
You had a varied career
you know,
after that.
we had a fire.
Yes.
I had the place rented out to a lady for about 10 years. I didn't realize it was 10 years, but she had a resale bridal store in there. And one day she decided that she could get cheaper rent somewhere else, which she did, and then it promptly went out of business. But the lady that was in there had a combination of a gift shop, very unique gift shop in the store, and a garden shop that took over most of my yard. So one day, I was sitting in my house. I lived behind the store, okay. I was sitting in my house watching the 3 o'clock news, and all of a sudden there was a knocking on the door, and they said, "You have to come with us." And it was a police officer. He says, "You have to come." I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "Don't ask, just come with me." And we went down where the yard was, where she had her flowers. And the smoke was so black you couldn't see where you were going. The store was on fire. And I didn't know it. I was just watching the news on television. And he dragged me out of there and said, "We have to go." And he was right, we did have to go. Nothing happened to my house, but the store burnt down all except the very front facade. Now, the front facade is still there.
Still there.
I'm sure you've seen it. My nephew Jim spent 5 years rebuilding that building and trying to keep up with all the new rules that city has.
City codes, but he did a good
City
job.
codes. Can you imagine?
It's a
Okay,
miraculous
here is this
reconstruction.
little building built in 1885, and it has to have 2 handicap ramps to get into it. 2 not 1, but 2. And handicap bathroom, and
What year was the fire?
it was 2011, I think. It was on my birthday. I had too many candles on the birthday cake, I'm told. Anyway, it was December 15th.
Of 2001?
Yeah. And so Jim spent, I think he's got some pictures there from the rebuilding the fire.
Good.
So that was when we actually had a newspaper in Tustin.
Well, Margaret, we will try to incorporate some of your photography into this video, but we're just delighted for the opportunity to get to chat with you a little bit and ask you some questions about the past, and this has been
Okay.
marvelous. We've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure Steve has too, and we will let you be one of the first to view it when we get it edited.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. We've really appreciated it.
Come and see us, We have a wonderful store in there now.
Yes,
They're doing such a good job.
yes, they are.
And they always have a crowd. And they had a thing there last week, something with the community association with all the volunteer organizations in Orange County. Did you see that?
Yes.
When they were out, did you see them? They were all, I was at my Seroptimus meeting over at the Elks Club, and when I got back, I couldn't even get in through to get to my house. It was so crowded with people.
Well,
So,
I'm glad to hear that they're doing a good job.
and they said, I asked one of the girls that works in the store, and I said, did you get any play off of that group that was out there? And she says, everybody out there told people to come in the store and check it out. So they did. They came in, and if they weren't in the, in the mood to buy things at that point, they know it's there and they'll come back. So anyway, we have action on
Good.
El Camino Real, known as D Street.